week, I think, to have her baby. Anybody know?
She was hoping to be here today,
yeah?
Unless she went in.
Oh, so if she makes it.
I talked to her yesterday, I believe.
Yeah.
She said she was going to try and call in, but not be able to.
I'm here. This is Ginger. I'm calling in. Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
I'm calling in. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
This is Charlie Fisher with Osbert calling in as well. I'm driving back from Salem, so I should be there probably in like 20 minutes. This is Charlie Fisher with Osbert calling in as well. I'm driving back from Salem.
Hi, Charlie.
Hello.
This is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
This is Karen.
Is there an echo? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. There's two of us.
So I think one thing, for those of you who are on the phone, you may need to mute when you're not speaking. Can't see the, let me look if I've got a display that can see the, no.
To enable or disable participant entry and exit tones, press *3. Mute or unmute your audio. Press *6. To repeat these options, press *0 at any time.
I think we'll wait just a couple more minutes to see if anyone else joins.
I haven't introduced myself. Morgan Smith is here. I was hoping to make it in person, but the day did not unfold that way.
Thanks, Morgan. I think we're just missing the legislature.
Hey, Emily, Andy Foltz is on the line as well.
Hey, Andy. I expect most of the legislative parts to just consider the second game. Yeah. So I think the only person so we'll wait just another minute or two.
are all at the. All right, so officially 5 minutes after the start time, so I think that's long enough to wait. So I think we should get started. I am Emily Matisar. I am the Government Accountability Attorney for Governor Kate Brown and the Vice Chair of the Sunshine Committee. Unfortunately, Michael Crone, the chair, could not be here today, so I am going to do my best to chair the meeting. Everyone probably already knows that Michael has big shoes to fill, and I don't expect to even come close to filling them. I will do my best. I really could use help with Robert's Rules of Order. That's the thing I'm most nervous about. So if I do something wrong or I don't do something I was supposed to do, please let me know. I think we'll start with introductions, first of members present in the room and then members on the phone, and then we can move on to guests. So I'm Emily. Selena Deckelman, Senior Director of Runtime for Mozilla.
If people on the phone could mute, that would be really appreciated.
Can they even hear us? I'm Eileen Akins. I'm an attorney. I primarily represent local government entities, and I'm here on this committee on behalf of the special districts in Oregon.
I'm Brent Walth. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Journalism and Communication at University of Oregon.
Okay, and who do we have by phone?
Mary Beth Herkridge, State Archivist.
Karen Johnson, City of Independence.
Morgan Smith, Polk County Council.
Charlie Fisher, Osberg.
Okay, and then guests we have by phone?
This is Ginger McCall, Oregon Public Records Advocate.
Andy Foltz, DOJ Public Records Counsel.
Okay. And then anybody in the room who wants to announce their presence?
I'm happy to do so. I'm Michelle Cole, and I'm representing Olivia.
Okay.
Nick Bednick from Society of Professional Journalists. And I'm Todd Albert, the Deputy Public Records Advocate for Oregon.
Okay, so Melina just left the room. The next thing I was gonna do was click her hosting.
Hi, I'm sorry, this is Charlie. Maybe I don't know if this is just me, but it's really difficult to hear what's being said in the room. So it's possible to move the microphone around, or if you can think, that'd be very helpful.
How about now, Charlie? Is that better?
That is much better. Yeah,
Okay.
love it. Thanks.
It was just distance to the mic, so not very technical. So I want to first thank Selena and Mozilla for hosting us while the legislature is bustling and unavailable for our committee meeting. The next thing I want to do is to approve the meeting minutes from the last meeting, which I believe was October 3rd. The minutes were circulated and posted on the website, and I also have extra copies here. So I hope everyone had a chance to look at them. Does anyone have any discussion or changes to the minutes? Oh, typos? Send me your typos. We don't have to discuss those.
Karen Johnson, I was present. I was not there by phone. I was present at the meeting.
Okay, we'll correct that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there? No? Okay. So I think this is one that we need a motion to approve. Any discussion? Any objection? Okay. Great. So the next item on the agenda is the discussion about the personal privacy exemptions. I think the way I'd like to do this is to have the Office of the Public Records Advocate introduce and summarize their report, which they prepared for our meeting. So I believe Todd is planning to do that in person.
We should give a mic, somebody take Brent's mic.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Well, good afternoon, committee members. As I stated earlier, my name is Todd Albert. I am the Deputy Public Records Advocate for Oregon. I will be presenting an overview of the report that we submitted in support of the Sunshine Committee's work. And it really will just be an overview. The report itself is fairly detailed, and I am happy to entertain any questions at the end that you might have about it. As you heard, on the phone with us is Ginger McCall, the public. So we were asked by this committee to submit a report investigating the privacy implications related to government bodies' holding of personally identifiable information, or PII. And just to be clear, the purpose of this report, as we understood it, was to present factual information rather than recommendations to the committee. We're merely providing information to support the
Emily, they keep cutting out.
Okay. Just try switching mics. Just trade. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let us know if that keeps happening.
Okay.
Well, as I was saying, we divided our report into 4 sections, the first of which provides an overview of the risks of disclosure of PII to unauthorized users and bad actors. The second section discusses the treatment of PII under the Federal Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. The third section provides an overview of a survey that we conducted of other states and Washington, D.C.'s public records laws to determine at what rate personal contact information, which is a subset of PII, was being exempted from disclosure. And we did this in comparison to the 22 personal contact information exemptions currently under consideration by this committee. And finally, in section 4, we reviewed the current status of Oregon law to determine if public bodies could selectively waive the confidentiality of a conditionally exempt public record, thus limiting its disclosure to a specific requester and for a specific purpose. And in that section, we also cited examples from other states' laws that do permit this sort of selective disclosure. So now I'm going to briefly discuss each section in turn. So first, we examine the malign effects of the release of PII during events such as data breaches. And this scenario presents different issues than those confronting governmental bodies that currently possess PII. But we thought it was important to include it because any consideration of PII and public records must take into effect how much PII should be held at all and the detrimental effects of its inadvertent release. Data breaches have increased in severity and frequency over time. And the effects of PII disclosure or breach can be quite serious and long-lasting, even from a single breach. Information that is stolen is often sold in marketplaces on the dark web, for instance. And permanent PII, such as medical history and social security numbers, or information that is difficult to change, such as social security numbers, bank accounts, or home addresses, can have long-lasting effects on victims, again, even after only a single breach. And just briefly, the types of malign uses of PII could include things like identity theft, which is, I think, pretty self-explanatory, as well as doxing or swatting. Doxing is the practice of publishing a person's private documents, or docs, against the person's wishes. Doxing is often part of online vigilantism as well, and frequently results in innocent parties facing threats and harassment. Swatting is the practice of anonymously contacting emergency services to falsely report serious incidents, which draws large amounts of law enforcement or SWAT teams to a victim's home. Swatting takes doxing to a much higher and dangerous level because law enforcement, of course, has no way of knowing whether or not these calls are real, and responds to these violent calls with excessive force. Swatting and doxing are increasingly on the rise and being used against private individuals who state public opinions and suddenly find themselves thrust into the public limelight, as well as against public officials. Now, just to be clear, the Office of the Public Records Advocate is not the state's privacy officer. We firmly believe that the public records law is one of disclosure, not confidentiality, but we are highlighting the safety and privacy implications in this report merely to indicate their weight and that they should be taken seriously when this committee is considering proposals on how to proceed while reviewing these personal information exemptions in Oregon law. So next, our report looked at privacy under FOIA, the Federal Freedom of Information Act, and if the federal government treated the PII of its employees any differently than those of the general public. FOIA actually includes two separate exemptions that cover privacy. There's a more general exemption for the information of individuals in personnel. Such information would constitute a clearly unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. There's a more limited exemption under FOIA as well that applies to law enforcement purposes and protects personal information when disclosure could reasonably be expected to constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. Now, both of these exemptions under FOIA protect not only information which is inherently private, but also an individual's control of the information concerning his or her own person. And much like Oregon's privacy exemptions, FOIA incorporates a balancing test. And in evaluating whether or not withholding information under the more general exemption of FOIA, agencies are required to conduct a four-step analysis, which I will not go into detail here. But suffice it to say, in consideration of this balancing test, courts have instructed agencies to default to a presumption of disclosure. Courts have also recognized a significant privacy interest under FOIA in PII, generally speaking, such as a person's name, address, image, computer user ID, phone number, and similar types of information. This information is generally given significant protection, and unless a countervailing FOIA public interest disclosure is shown. The privacy of outside individuals who contact the government have also been afforded protection by the courts. Effectively, the courts have found that the identity of those who contact the government generally bears some protection, even if the substance of what they're contacting the government about does not. There are exceptions as well. For instance, courts have held that the names of FOIA requesters and individuals who comment on proposed agency rules should be released. As for civilian federal employees who are not involved in law enforcement or sensitive occupations, there generally is no expectation of privacy regarding their names, titles, grades, salaries, and duty stations, or anything related to their successful employment applications. However, those employees, similar to the general public, have a protectable privacy interest in purely personal details that do not shed light on agency functions. This has been especially carved out by the Supreme Court for an employee's home address, but could include other information like private contact information, signatures, personal phone numbers, personal email addresses, and information of that kind. Overall, there appears to be no distinguishable difference between government employees and members of the public in how their PII is treated by the federal government. Both qualify for personal privacy protection under FOIA's exemptions. The only difference that we could see is that some FOIA requests may generate PII of public employees because you could potentially weigh the balancing test more in favor of disclosure given the work that public employees do versus information held by the government about the general public. So after consideration of FOIA, we moved on to a survey of all other states, all other 49 states, as well as Washington, D.C., and how their public records laws treat personal contact information of the same type that is being considered by this committee. The frequency of exemptions, most like those under consideration here, were noted in the report as this seemed like the best way to basically try to aggregate a very large amount of information and present it in a meaningful way for this committee to use. In a lot of instances, these exemptions that we found in other states were broadly similar to those under consideration here in Oregon, although they also differed greatly in terms of how much information could or could not be disclosed in comparison to the 22 exemptions that are being reviewed here. In a lot of ways, looking at 51 jurisdictions, including Oregon's, was like comparing apples and oranges, and that's why we thought noting their frequency with some caveats and explanatory language about the way they're used in other jurisdictions might be the most useful type of information for this committee. Finally, section 4 of the report deals with the selective waiver of conditional exemptions and what Oregon law does or does not say about them. Some public records in Oregon are conditionally exempt from disclosure, as I'm sure this committee well knows at this point, and may be disclosed upon satisfying a balancing test that weighs a recognized governmental or privacy interest in confidentiality against the public interest in disclosure. What we understood the Sunshine Committee to be considering is whether records that are conditionally exempt could be disclosed to an individual requester for use for a specific this is not a
We've lost the phone line again.
Can you hear me?
somebody.
We can hear you now.
Yes,
We
I
lost
can
about
hear you now.
2 seconds.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear Todd?
Yep.
I can hear you now.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I have the AV folks are looking at it right now, so they might have restarted something, but
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
sorry.
I think I'll just muddle through to the end. Not try to backtrack. So, as I was saying, although this is not a settled matter in Oregon law, what we found is that there is currently no prohibition that prevents a public body from waiving an exemption and disclosing a confidentially exempt record in this manner, which is to a specific user for a specific purpose. There's a lot more detail that goes into that consideration. I'd be happy to answer questions about it, but I don't think anyone necessarily wants to hear a drawn-out legalistic discussion from me at this point. The one thing I will say is that in our large review of other states' public records law, we did encounter other states that do prohibit or permit limited disclosure of conditionally exempt records. And for instance, I think the one that was most on point or has pretty much the most exacting language that would be a yes to this issue is Georgia, which says in part in its Open Records Act, records and information disseminated pursuant to this paragraph may be used only by the authorized recipient and only for the authorized purpose. Therefore, in sum, just to briefly go over what our report states, we found that the disclosure of PII poses significant risks, including the risk of identity theft, doxing, and swatting, which should be closely considered by the committee as it proceeds. In light of these risks, other jurisdictions have taken a cautious approach to release of PII, particularly personal contact information, at least from what we could see from other states. Many jurisdictions limit the disclosure of personal addresses, personal email addresses, personal phone numbers, and other related PII. While some states do not draw distinctions between the privacy of government employees and the privacy of members of the public, while some states do draw these distinctions, the federal government does not, and it really is a mixed bag overall, carve-outs or not. Finally, one possible path to balancing these privacy interests with the public interest in disclosure more closely aligned with Georgia's if that was something the committee was interested in considering. And otherwise, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity presented to our office to assist this committee. We look forward to reading your conclusions, and thank you for this important work. And if anyone has questions now, I'd be happy to answer them.
Are there any questions from members? Oh. I'll just take this.
Hi, thank you for the report. I really appreciate it. This is Selena speaking. I read through the examples of disclosure, and I was wondering, did you have any examples of disclosure that were the result of public records requests?
You're talking about inadvertent disclosure of PII or purposely malign uses?
Yeah.
No, which again highlights the difference between these two issues.
Yes.
This was also a section that I believe might have been Ginger, so she might have encountered some examples.
Yeah.
Ginger, did you encounter any examples that Selena's asking about?
I'm trying to recall if the examples that I had encountered were things that were released as a result of public records. I know some of them did involve public employees being doxxed. I can't recall if that was the result of a public records disclosure.
Yeah, I looked at the 5 examples. I saw one was data scraped from LinkedIn, and then the remaining were targeted attacks, like a hacker got into some data source that may or may not have been secured well, and then that was the disclosure. Okay, thank you.
And I should add, of course.
Yeah, I know there were some examples that involved like police officers, public safety officers, but I'm not sure if those disclosures were the result of public records.
Yeah, in that case, the ICE example, it was scraping information from LinkedIn that the individuals had posted, not assuming that they weren't going to be doxxed, of course. That was not why they posted their information. But yeah, it was LinkedIn. Okay, the other question about financial institutions and identity theft and fraudulent use of that information. Identity theft is as old as time. It's been around forever. And I'm wondering if when you were looking at other states' information, you came across anything about like financial institutions being held liable. We do have like the one act that applies to credit card companies, and there's a bit of that applies to banks as well, but it's different for banks and credit card companies, which I thought was kind of interesting. Or if you'd seen any other like dealing with fraud type legislation related to
In those states' public records laws related to the state's holding of public records information and not what they do with private actors. So although they routinely address the state or any public body's holding of things like financial information, we didn't do a review of how they dealt with private financial institutions in their state.
Okay, thank you. Cool.
Any other questions for Todd?
Well, I guess and this isn't exactly related to your report, but it is a kind of a question that I'm wondering if you ran into during your research. And I think one of the challenges as I've been thinking about this is that ideally there would be some sort of public interest balancing test that worked, but it seems, as is the case from a lot of testimony from people in the press, that it doesn't work how it should, and oftentimes agencies are using it as a shield instead of implementing it correctly. So I'm wondering, did you run into kind of how states or FOIA deal with kind of something like that, where an agency isn't necessarily applying the public interest test appropriately, and what a remedy might be based on what has happened elsewhere?
No, and that's an interesting issue, but given the scope of the report and the amount of data that we had to go through just to try to answer these questions, unfortunately, we didn't look into things, and presumably you're talking about things like fines or fees or attorney's fees and things of that nature, which have a corollary in Oregon law as well. But no, that's not an area that we explored for this report, unfortunately.
Sure, thanks.
Sure.
Great report, by the way.
This is Ginger. I can speak to that for federal FOIA. Federal FOIA has a pretty robust administrative appeal process where if you were wrongly denied something, you would appeal it, and then you could potentially litigate and have review of the court with full attorney fees at the end if you prevail. So there are pretty robust review opportunities available under the federal FOIA, which is where all of this ends up getting hashed out. And I will say, under federal FOIA, there's a lot of court doctrine on the privacy-related exemptions because they are the more conditional exemptions that do involve balancing tests. So there is a lot of case law on it that helps to spell out how agencies should manage this data, which I think that helps agencies decide what they're going to do when they receive a FOIA request, whereas here in Oregon, there's not so much case law.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that is in reviewing other states and what they do, you run into public records law as short as one page, which has absolutely no right of appeal or any mechanism for dealing with agencies that don't respond to public records requests, to really robust systems like, say, Connecticut, that has public records panel that you could appeal to that can make binding decisions and impose fines and fees and all other types of remedies that aren't necessarily available in a lot of places. So you're going to find perhaps as many ways to deal with this as there are states that have public records law at this point, for sure.
All right. Any other discussion about the report? Todd and Ginger and the Office of the Public Records Advocate for your report and your Okay, so now we can proceed to the discussion on our recommendations on the personal privacy exemptions, which we've been considering for the last several meetings. I just would like to acknowledge that we've gotten some comments both from committee members and from the public that we consider tabling this recommendation for the future because, well, I'll let people explain why they want to do that. So I don't exactly know how to proceed. I think that we could discuss the, sort of everything we've done to this point and everything we've heard, and then decide to make a recommendation. We can use Michael Crone's memo from over the summer. We could go through this decision points document, which I updated incorporating some of the later received committee and public comments. And I brought copies if people didn't get that. Or we could table it. And so I don't really know how to lead this conversation because I don't know what the committee wants to do. So I think, well, I'll just open the floor. Hello.
Emily, this is Mary Beth, and
Hi,
I'm
Mary Beth.
I'm the one who's sent in, I know, to Michael about tabling this and moving forward. If the suggestion is the same, is very similar to the one we last discussed, we were nowhere near consensus on Michael's recommendation. A lot of us had major issues with it, and I think that's what led to asking Ginger to do that investigation into other stuff. Right now, I mean, I feel pretty strongly. I feel I'm not ready. I mean, if we bring it up for a vote, I will vote no, just because I don't feel we're to a point where we can make that recommendation moving forward and have it be considered seriously by the legislature or anybody that we thoroughly investigated it. It's just such a difficult issue. I would rather see us table it, go back, get some momentum, get a decent process in place and some credibility in place by looking at other exemptions that we know we can get to consensus with, and then move forward. And that's why I made the recommendation. I've been toying with the idea of making that recommendation for a while, and even before our last meeting. So that's just my point of view on why I wanted to move forward with that.
Thank you, Mary Beth. And I think that, you know, we received several comments, public comments. The same thing. So what do other members think?
I agree with Mary Beth. I would like to actually suggest, at the peril of making myself responsible for something, that we actually have a subcommittee investigate some of these categories of data, both the data and the exemptions, and maybe parallelize this effort a little more and meet a little more frequently. A problem that I'm encountering as a layperson in the world of public records is that it's a lot of information to take in and to kind of maintain continuous attention. And having 2 or 3 months go by between these meetings is too much for me personally. But I would be willing to commit to like an hour phone call, you know, every month or even every 2 weeks, actually, I think would be better for making progress for some period of time. But I could see how the entire committee would struggle with that kind of a time commitment. But I would love to see a smaller group go off and look at something. It doesn't have to be the privacy, the personal information exceptions. It could be something else. And I agree with Mary Beth, it would probably be better to tackle something that had a little less, that was a little less fraught. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
This is Brent. Selena, I was just smiling because whenever somebody suggests a subcommittee, there's always a fear that, you know, you're going to find yourself on it. And I was weighing that myself. I want to echo these sentiments. I don't think we're in a position to vote today. I think the first recommendation from a committee that's by law committed to finding greater ways for pathways for transparency and seeking ways to eliminate the things that impede transparency. We have to be very careful about how we word this and be clear about what question we're really answering. And I don't think we're quite there yet. I agree that a subcommittee could help work through these issues. Everybody is totally committed and sincere in their approach and their discussions on this. But I'm not clear what it is we would be voting on. And without language in front of us, that makes it difficult. And I would really hesitate without understanding the potential consequences, unforeseen consequences of what we might vote on, what message we might be sending without being really clear. And I think that takes more time. So I would echo and support that idea that perhaps not table, but postpone to a future date might be the right phrase, but whatever it is. Yeah.
I guess I don't have a strong objection to that. I think we should think about, well, obviously the role of what the subcommittee would do and what it would look at. It seems that the purpose of it would be to further consider the privacy exemptions. At least it seems to me that maybe there, and I could be completely wrong on this, maybe there are other exemptions that are easier to weigh in this format that don't require kind of the deep dive that something like this definitely seems to require. So yeah, I agree. I'm not completely ready to vote either.
We lost you again.
I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I guess my only concern, excuse me, is that I think one of the things that's prevented us from moving forward is that this is a very polarizing question. I mean, there's the media represented here who have, one position, and then the government representatives who are advocating for something slightly different. And my only concern is that I don't know that kicking it down the road is going to resolve that. And it may be that a subcommittee could sort of try to strike some kind of compromise, but that sort of assumes that the people in the room are willing to accept that. So just, that's my only concern, is I don't see that putting it off is necessarily going to make it any easier the next time we bring it up. So that's my take on it. I don't have a strong feeling one way or the other whether we should do it now or later, but that's my concern.
So I seem to remember the idea of subcommittees came up before, and I believe it was pretty unanimously rejected by the committee, but it sounds like people are more open to the idea of having subcommittees now. Is that right? Am I hearing that correctly?
I think if it helps advance our agenda, I'd be in favor of that. And it kind of sounds like that's what others are thinking too, is that it may be the only way to kind of advance the conversations in any meaningful way and without rehashing the same stuff every meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question for Mary Beth. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes. No, go ahead.
Okay. Mary Beth, if we were to look at a different set of exemptions, what would you recommend as being an alternative to what we're looking at now?
I would probably look at things that are no longer needed, or exemptions that are in direct conflict with the federal FOIA. Those I think are pretty easy to look at and make recommendations on from this committee. It would also help us to build momentum and get a process. I think my biggest concern is dealing with personal privacy and PII, is that it's the most difficult of all the ones to handle, and we really don't have a good handle on how we want to deal with it. So I think if we go to a subcommittee, then the subcommittee has to have a clear understanding of how they're going to answer the questions. And I don't even know if we have that in place yet. Is what questions do we ask, and then what's valid, if we're going to continue along this way. So I'd rather take, something that we can look at. We can honestly take a look at some of these exemptions that have been in place for years, say that's no longer valid. And that's pretty easy to justify, and we can, ask the right questions. Or that one's in direct conflict with federal FOIA, so that one probably needs to be eliminated and moved on. Either that, or we have to sit down, if we're going to go the subcommittee route, which I don't have a problem with. It has to have clear understanding of how they're going to move forward with it, so that we understand, have a clear idea of what we're voting on.
Right. Sorry, go ahead. And someone else was going to say something. Thank you, Mary Beth.
Was somebody on the phone waiting to say something?
This is Morgan from Polk County. I guess I'll weigh in a little bit because I was one of the more vocal opponents to subcommittees, because I think it turned into herding cats. But I tend to agree that the personal privacy exemption, the views of the group are so kind of polar opposites on some of these things that a subcommittee might be a better option, than one that meets a little bit more frequently and allows for a little bit more robust discussion. And then, as Mary Beth said, we can move on to kind of some lower hanging fruit to get some momentum at the main committee level.
Okay. Well, it sounds like at least a majority does not oppose subcommittees, so maybe we should consider a motion or vote on whether we should create, let's start with a subcommittee.
And then could we spend some time talking through, then I don't know how the Robert's Rules thing's going to work here, but then can we spend some time talking about the charter for that subcommittee, right? And maybe we could spend our time after that working out specifically what that would be.
I was going to suggest that maybe we should do it the opposite direction.
Okay.
Before we vote to create something that we don't know what it's going to do, we should think about what the sidebars and mandate for that subcommittee would be, and then entertain a motion on creating that subcommittee with the members that we've kind of determined would be in it.
Okay. So what would the subcommittee do?
I didn't say that I was going to answer that question.
I'm opening it to anyone to contribute. So we do have the criteria that we worked out, the 4-ish questions, but it sounds like that's not enough. We need something about a recommendation and how the recommendation would look, is what I'm hearing.
That's what it sounds like. I mean, it seems like ultimately that would be the role of the subcommittee, is to come back to this group with a recommendation and then we vote on it, I guess. But in terms of what the subcommittee would do, I mean, when I sent in my email in response to the report that the Public Records Advocate sent, I mean, my initial thought is the definition of PII. I think one thing we could do is propose a common understanding of what's included in that, because I think ultimately what's in that will sort of drive what should or shouldn't be done with that information if it's personally identifiable. So I think that would be a fairly easy first step, is to define that. And then the next step, it seems, would be to, I kind of find Michael's, I assume Michael created this kind of decision point analysis. We kind of go through each one and talk about, what are the benefits of disclosure versus not. And then based on that, coming back with some recommendations of, and I'm imagining some kind of, there's kind of the default position with some sort of limited exceptions under certain circumstances, kind of an approach that we could recommend that would enable the press to do their jobs without necessarily giving away more information than is necessary. And that's just thinking about that right now, if I had to do it today.
Okay, so it sounds like we're moving sort of towards having the subcommittee tackle the PII question while the main Sunshine Committee moves on to sort of an easier, less contentious group of exemptions. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's what I'm hearing in beautiful Polk County.
How I'm viewing it is that like we're kind of parallelizing the effort so that like a subgroup of people can kind of pursue that and be reporting out to the main group as we go along. I think all of it's going to come back to us. So it's, I don't think that we're really delegating the whole decision-making process there, but I think that's important, because another thing that I'm interested in is a little more research into the impact, like what Brent was talking about. We're going to come up with some language, it's going to have an effect, and so I'd like to explore that a little bit. So let's say that we adopted some of these decision points. How would that play out in practice? And I think that we've got to weigh the issues that happen when you've got like a fully computerized like database system that you can separate out all the records, and you've got paper records. Like there's kind of some different issues going on there. And I think I also want to ask some questions of our chief data officer around this, and whether there's anything that we can do to, for example, just start labeling data and classifying it better, or if there's work already happening there and how that plays into this. That's some of the stuff that I want to find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have some similar questions. One of them is I don't think I completely understand and can wrap my head around the implications of either, well, yeah, just the implications of either tightening up personal information in terms of how that would impact the ability of people to, on a regular basis, do public interest journalism, for example, But then I guess the other question that I have again is about the real world impact of this. And again, it's focused on just the fact that I guess from the testimony that we've received, there are circumstances where even if we perfectly came up with a public interest balancing test that worked, we then have agencies that aren't applying it correctly. And I think we have to think about a way to ensure that when we theoretically come up with these recommendations, they're actually going to be carried out in a consistent manner between all of the public agencies that are having their records requested. So I think I would want the subcommittee to also be looking at something like that in its scope of work.
I would disagree with including that in the scope of work. This is Morgan again, because that's more of an enforcement and kind of effectuation of the law rather than whether the exemptions themselves are appropriate, needed, or overly verbose, etc. I think the mechanisms for enforcing the law are a whole separate topic that I think we should get a more clear recommendation on what the laws would look like in a perfect world that balance more interests, and from there take the next step of how do you enforce it if it's not being interpreted correctly at the local level.
I guess my response to that would be, I mean, at least from my perspective, I think that's pretty easy, is you would have and people can disagree with this from different perspectives. You would have basically a test that says personal information that has potential to, allow identity theft would have some sort of balancing test. And I don't know exactly, I would like it to be, I'm not sure whether it'd be on the side of disclosure unless there's, you can prove that there's no public interest reason for that being disclosed or vice versa. But it seems to me that we can't have the conversation of what, in this particular instance, what the theory would be unless we also are thinking about what it's going to, how that theory is going to be put into practice. So I don't see how we can completely separate the two.
Do you see, this is Eileen, do you see, dovetailing off that?
Yeah.
Do you see a difference between how this particular type of information would be handled from an enforcement perspective than anything else? Or I think to Morgan's point, there would be kind of a general discussion about enforcement of these laws, and this would be included in that. I mean, do you see it being handled separately?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. My main thing is just especially in this, there is a valid and really important balancing act that has to be undertaken, whereas maybe in other public records exemptions, that's not as much the case. And so since that balancing is so important in this particular instance, I think it's particularly relevant here. But I don't know, I don't know if as we go forward, maybe it actually will turn out that this is something that, this particular question is something that needs to be thought about in a more broader context. Yeah.
Sorry, fighting. I should move over so we don't have to keep fighting over the same microphone. And this is Eileen again. And my initial thought, I mean, I see your point. I mean, this obviously, because it's a very sensitive topic and people have strong feelings about it one way or the other. I can see why it might necessitate some separate enforcement conversation. But I'm inclined to think that Morgan's approach about just at some point when we will decide what we think should be exempt and not exempt from disclosure in all areas, and then have a general discussion about enforcement of the laws, because part of that is not only you express the frustration of journalists or others who request information and feel like they're being stonewalled. And I represent 100 or so local governments who sometimes get the crap harassed out of them for no legitimate reason because people assume that they're stonewalling and they're not. So there is currently no mechanism in the law for local governments to sort of avoid that. I mean, I have a client right now who's being sued in circuit court for $40. Same person keeps trying every agency they can think of to try to get them to produce documents that they have, and he just doesn't want to pay the $5.20 it takes to pick them up. So that kind of thing, in my experience, is fairly common, and that there's no mechanism for local governments at all to, and there may never be, but to sort of so anyway, in light of that, that's just me editorializing, but from the opposite side, both sides sort of have an interest in remedies. You know, what do we do under this circumstance? So I'd like to see it be part of a larger conversation that looks at all possibilities.
Yeah, I would just add, I think I think that the concern is just that I think my recommendation in terms of what we would want public records law to look like would be different if we're assuming that the current way that it's being applied is what is going to happen. And so I think that you have to make a different recommendation if you think that agencies are going to try to circumvent it, as opposed to an assumption that they wouldn't, right? And so
my clients wouldn't.
Of course. Yeah. So yeah,
no, that's a very good point. And yeah, just I think in the broader discussion, we tend to sort of assume that the conversations we're having here are just with respect to the state of Oregon, but they include all government entities in Oregon, including some that are very, very tiny and have no staff and no budget. So anyway, that needs to be part of the larger conversation too, is it's not a matter of just forcing the state of Oregon to be compliant. It's a matter of what's going to be best and workable for other forms of local governments as well.
Yeah.
So, but thank you. I think you raise a good point. The whole problem with the public interest balancing test is it's subjective.
Right. So
what we as the governments think is not in the public interest, there's an argument that it would be. So because it's subjective, it's hard to draw a bright line in terms of how you define that, but I think we can talk about that some more.
Another thing that I'm interested in the committee doing is just defining a few terms, like defining what public disclosure means in this context, I think would be really helpful. And differentiating between the rules that apply to bulk data access, individual records. Yeah, I think there just needs to be some definition of terms.
Okay, that sort of fits with what Eileen was saying about what is PII, period.
Yeah.
So.
Well, can you further say what you mean by defining what public disclosure means, just to put a finer point on that? I think I know what you mean, but.
I think one of the things that, and this is, me being a layperson in this world, right? So as I was reading the report from the Public Records Advocate, it was talking about different kinds of disclosures that came about through different means. And to me, there's like a pretty important difference between those things. Like it's just in security terms, it's very difficult to protect an entire system from an individual who is determined to get access to that information. But in general, like we make the entire system safe by having, certain safeguards, whatever. So as I was looking at this, I was like, are we talking about preventing, the media from getting access to information that they then use to confirm data that they're using for a story? Or are we talking about someone taking something and posting it on Twitter or a blog or whatever? And I think that those are different things. And I don't know if the law actually thinks that those are different things. And Eileen's like, nope. And I don't know, that seems relevant to this conversation, that, in the case of investigation of corruption in the government, I'm not sure how you figure that out without having some of this information disclosed. And then there's that balancing test of, is that, and this is why we have the balancing test, right? So you can look in there and say, like, is this the time where we disclose this potentially private or embarrassing information. So I don't know. I think that's a worthwhile thing to discuss, that sometimes we're talking about disclosing, a bunch of data to somebody who's responsibly looking through it and then using it to some better purpose. Or we're talking about somebody who's like harassing an individual, stalking someone, doxing, like whatever. And those are really different purposes.
Thanks.
So it seems like we have kind of a broad framework for what a subcommittee would. Unless people want to get more specific or offer more suggestions for what this particular subcommittee could do.
I do.
You do?
I do.
Brent.
It seems to me that sort of the broad approach is how we got here now. And I want to posit this idea that in order for us to be making a recommendation, I think the committee has to make the case that the system does not work the way it is. Otherwise, we could just say it's all good. And I think there's opinions and feelings all around that we should say something about changing it. But it's not clear, I think, entirely what those are for everybody. And I think it's the subcommittee, I think, needs to be able to identify in what ways should the law change. What is currently not working? What could work better? What should be protected? I think we should not lose sight of the fact that our charge is to increase transparency where possible, not reduce it. And keep that in mind as the subcommittee goes forward. Doesn't mean we don't discuss everything. We talk about everything, but that should be part of it. So what I'm suggesting is that we set out as a committee of the whole, produce maybe 5 or 6 questions that the subcommittee needs to address. In other words, help focus the subcommittee so there are targets to answer. Otherwise, the subcommittee could go off, come up with big ideas, great ideas, and not really get to the heart of what we as a group think are the central questions. So, and I don't know if this is the right setting, or I don't know how we could, if we kicked potential questions around now, for example, whether we could draft them here, or whether we could ask, for example, ask the members to come back in a week or 2 weeks with those questions, so the committee could get to work, not 3 months from now. But I think we have to give the subcommittee a mission, very specific.
I agree with that, and I say we have 2 hours, so why don't we give it a shot?
Okay.
All right.
Seems like, I mean, the first one, what are the different kinds of PII, is a good one.
To define it?
Yeah. I feel like, I mean, the difference between someone's name and their social security number, obviously, is very different, especially the two of those combined. So thinking about personal information in terms of the level of potential risk is important. And I like what Selena said about defining if we should consider whether different levels of disclosure based on certain characteristics is something we should consider.
My sense in the conversations, again, this is Eileen, the conversations we've had to date, there has been a lot of very credible information from members of the media in this group, and people not only on the committee, but also those who have testified. And I know there is a bill currently going to be proposed, House Bill something or other, I can't remember the number, that seeks to sort of carve out an exemption in public records law for members of the media. And the conversation I'm having with the SDAO lobbyist is, well, who's going to define media, especially these days when we all sort of know there's newspapers and radio and TV, but there's also bloggers and, any number of other people who would call themselves media. So I guess my question for those who are representing the media in this group is, if there was a way to credibly define media, would it be a fair compromise to say that, if the request is coming from the press, that it will be treated one way versus just kind of Joe Schmo who just wants to look at stuff? Would that be a satisfying resolution, or do you see that as being a little too oh, I don't know, problematic in some way.
Just to add in, I'll echo Eileen's comments on that. We dealt with the issue of what is the media for the purposes of executive sessions like 8 years ago, and I still don't think there's really a clear answer. It just adds more ambiguity upon public entities to try and discern exactly who's asking for something. So if we can get we'd need some kind of buy-in from the journalism community to define what exactly is a media member if we're going to set up ways to articulate different levels of disclosure depending on who's asking. Otherwise, you're just adding another layer of ambiguity that some, minimally staffed local government agency is going to be forced to define and going to be accused of doing something wrong no matter what.
True.
I think I would be more inclined, rather than choosing entities that can have special access, because I guess, OSPRG, we aren't the media, but we do public records requests every once in a while that are in the public interest. And I'd imagine individuals would as well. It seems like maybe and I think this was in the report about the kind of contract or whatever you want to call it for what the use of the information is, in terms of this particular bulk data you're not going to disclose publicly, and you're going to, so it seems to me that the uses would be a better way to define the different terms, ways of disclosure, as opposed to the entity that's doing the requesting. And then maybe something around, if a entity has gone through that process and has established that they are operating in good faith, and maybe that they enter onto some sort of good list that allows them to expedite the process. But I just thought of that, so I'm not recommending that, but something that maybe we should consider.
And I commented on this in the email that I sent also, is that was appealing to me. So I can't remember which jurisdiction it was. Somebody else might remember. The one that says that you have to basically sort of attest to the fact that you're only going to use the information for this particular purpose, and then there's penalties built in if you don't, which would be kind of a pain in the butt to enforce, I think. But that's kind of along that line, that it's really based more on, what do you intend to do with this information, as opposed to just, I want it so I can, come to your public meeting and bitch at you for a long time. I mean, I don't know if so I get that. I can also tell you that, and again, to echo, Morgan and I are coming at it from a very similar perspective, in that with our clients, they want bright lines. That would help them. That would help them to know, what do we have to do? When do we have to do it? Great. When you start getting into areas of discretion and you end up in arguments with people about, I interpret things this way or the other way, it creates all kinds of administrative headaches for the agency. And I don't know realistically how clear we can make those bright lines, but I think if we could somehow clarify that in these circumstances you do this, and in these other circumstances you don't have to do any of that, I think that would probably help them tremendously. So
This sounds to me, there's actually quite a large body of work there that we can draw from, to help clarify what the usage is. Data, I think, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but just from the little bit that I've had working here, there's some work that's been done to try to classify those uses as well. So I think just with a little bit of research, the subcommittee could dig into that a little bit and just see what's out there in terms of licensing data. And then see if that could apply to this situation.
That would be an interesting.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of prior art.
Sounds like you're volunteering to be on the subcommittee.
Oh God,
I suggested it. Sure.
I honestly, I'm happy to. It sounds like there were a lot of other interested people too. So
that's true. I know we're not at that point yet, but if we need someone to represent the government side, I'd be happy to be on the subcommittee. Okay, cool.
This is Morgan from Polk. I'd be happy to represent government side too, but it might be a bit of a shifted subcommittee at that point, but I'm happy to do the work as well.
Awesome.
We have volunteers. Not only do we have a subcommittee, but we have members of the subcommittee.
Brent, might you be able to further define what the question that you wanted to include in there was in terms of kind of like in what ways the law should change or?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of sort of stacking the questions in some sort of sequence,
Okay.
in a way that helps the subcommittee work through these. And I'm not proposing particular sequence, I'm just suggesting questions. So one might simply be now when it comes to personal.
Brent, could you
Yes.
repeat that question? I couldn't hear it. You cut out.
Yes, okay. I was just posing potential questions, not in any particular sequence, but what are the particular and specific issues people have with the way the Oregon public records law works now with regard to public PII? Of course, we'd have to define what we're talking about, but assuming we get to that point. So what are we actually trying to address? What is the problem we're trying to address? Problems, potentially. In what ways can we actually increase transparency by addressing these problems? In what way can we can address concerns about misuse of PII? In other words, to address all the other issues that have come up by everybody here. Those would be a sample of kind of the questions and then actually come up with specific proposals. But I think working through that, and then I'm obviously those are not all the possible questions, but those are the kinds of questions. In some ways, like I said, I've struggled with trying to understand what question we're trying to answer, and I think that would be, I think, input from the committee. People, members of the committee could we all pose questions and hopefully try to put them together. If we get 4 or 5, that we can then put to the subcommittee.
I think one question that we're trying to answer is how can government effectively manage the exemptions, right? So right now with this many exemptions existing, it's hard. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think the first question is, I'd like where Brett was going with it, because I think that's going to answer your question. Is part of it is, do we even know what we're looking at? And that's been my problem. This gets to the heart of what my frustration is with the whole PII thing, is I think we lost sight of what we were trying to do. And I think those first 3 questions that Brent mentioned, I think get at the heart of what are we trying to do. And it may be simply just combining them all so that it's one exemption, but we don't know that right now because we don't know what we're trying to answer. So I think those are where we're getting to, is what you're mentioning, but I think we need to answer those 3 questions first and then figure out how do we get there.
I want to maybe throw out another idea for questions, which sort of came up when I was looking at SPJ's comments, which is they suggested that, for example, state-issued employee IDs are never protected, are always disclosed. So that sort of made me think we could ask sort of 2 questions: what should never be exempt and what should always be exempt? Because I do think that there are, like, for example, Social Security numbers. I don't think I saw any public comment saying that we should send out Social Security numbers in a public records request. So I think that could sort of, those 2 questions, we could sort of weed out some of the easier, hard stuff, right? So that's an idea.
And then I think related to that, it'd be great to, because I don't have my head completely wrapped around it, have articulated the public interest reasons for each piece of PII, so that we actually can figure out what we would be giving up, say, if we made it harder to access certain pieces of it, or what would be made easier and more to the benefit of public interest if we made it easier.
I like where you're going, Emily, but I think sometimes the stuff that should always be exempt, does that mean if it's in conjunction with something else that it would still be exempt. So, you know, when you put name, like employee name or whatever, does that ever need to be exempt? Personally, no. My answer would be no, it never needs to be exempt. But if it's in conjunction with something else, that the two of them together would make it needing to be exempt, I think that's where you're going to get into that push-pull kind of thing again.
This is Karen from Independence. Another thing to consider too is currently the law states that generally the identity, motive, and need of the requester for the requesting access is irrelevant. And so we don't ask those kinds of questions when people come to City Hall to get records. So is there some way we could ask the identity, motive, and need, so that way we could right then and there say, oh yeah, you have a really good need for this information, or no, you don't have a good need for that because you've demonstrated, you have not demonstrated that you have a good need for that personal privacy information.
I agree with that concept in theory, and that we're supposed to be blind to who's asking for the information, but I think it just opens another minefield for the public entities from an equal treatment and discrimination type of aspect of we then have to dictate which classes of people do have access to information and which don't, which just more or less will have a chilling effect on any desire to release information on behalf of public entities. So I don't think there's a good answer to that question, and that's the fundamental thing we've been dealing with for the last 2 meetings here is journalists saying that they have a heightened need to access information because of their role as journalists, even though they themselves say that they wouldn't actually publish information they're receiving from us because they recognize it's sensitive information. But from our perspective at the government level is we don't get to ask those questions, and we don't get to differentiate between how we treat who comes to the counter based on who they are and why they're asking for things. So I don't know if there is any real way to answer that question or solve that problem.
Well, I think that is could be addressed. It's a question of what are you going to do with this information, and I think a very reasonable baseline is, just thinking in terms of like both data transfer, like selling that, right? Like if you, it's probably not what we want to see happen, not what an individual Oregonian would want to see happen with their personal information. And then but I explore and see, what is actually happening out there. Because I'm not sure that we really know.
Yeah, and I think maybe the one thing to think about is the direction that the license goes. So maybe it should wrestle with license says this is what you can use it for versus that these are the things that you say you won't use it for. That way, I think, sometimes I think you might request a record not exactly knowing what you're going to find from it, but knowing that you're investigating some sort of public interest question. And so maybe you would say you're not going to use this for commercial purposes, or to, you're not going to paste it on Twitter, but you can do anything else with it or something like that. So that should be maybe figuring out how that license should work. It's a good question.
If the subcommittee takes up that approach, I like that approach. I think would be good to talk about. I think part of that will have to be, again, enforcement. I mean, if somebody says they're going to use it for something and they sign something that says they're going to use it for a particular purpose and then they don't, then it's going to be incumbent upon the public agency to go out and sue them, and I can tell you that most of them don't have the time or the resources or the chutzpah to continually monitor that kind of process. So that might be part of the conversation that we have about how would we implement that. And then if somebody violates it, then what?
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like we have a few sort of guiding principles for the subcommittee. Does anyone have other suggestions for things that the subcommittee should specifically address?
I think, this is Morgan again, I think one thing to look at would be a consolidation of the PII exemptions, just because there are so many of them scattered in different places. I think if we can organize and compartmentalize them into different areas and shrink them down to make them a little bit more accessible, I think that would improve a lot of things, both on the side of the requester and the government agency, just if everyone's on an even playing field and understanding where all the exemptions are, if they're all in one spot and they're pretty easier to understand, I think that'll increase transparency in a lot of ways, because we aren't going to be stuck in a kind of a quagmire. So given just the sheer volume of different exemptions that reference PII, I think a main charge might be to find a way to consolidate them into something a little bit more readable.
I agree.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
A lot of agreement.
I feel like that's the one thing we can all agree.
Yay!
All right, so I will maybe draft up these thoughts that we've just been talking about and circulate a sort of list of questions or ideas for the subcommittee to tackle, and send that around. I might make Michael do it, we'll see. So,
Should we take a vote on creating the subcommittee?
okay,
Yeah.
great.
Can I just ask, sorry, can I ask a question before that? Are you suggesting that you sort of send that around and then what's the process for approving that? I think we should talk about that, because I know we need to make sure that it would be ideally we would have this going before the next meeting. And I think there's some questions about, or some things we need to make sure in terms of public meetings laws that we are deliberating publicly.
Mm-hmm.
If possible, I think I would want us to at least preliminarily lay out what those questions are for the subcommittee. Yeah.
Can I ask it just a public, I had this question earlier for Emily and wasn't sure. So in terms of what's required, can we deliberate on a public mailing list, like an email list? Does that comply with the law or not?
No.
No?
No.
Not really, not unless it's something that's accessible to anyone who wants to hop on, I suppose, or advertise it in that way, and anybody who wanted to could access it. I guess arguably that could work.
Yeah, so what I'm talking about, so it's possible to create a mailing list, right, that is publicly archivable and that anyone can post to or read from.
Like a chat.
I would probably say no. I think because there wouldn't be any kind of real-time observation of the discussions.
Okay, so real-time observation of the discussion is a requirement.
I would say so, but I'd also defer to Eileen to see what she thinks as the other government lawyer in the room.
Well, I agree. Well, I guess this is a question that comes up. I teach this subject and it comes up often, but we generally, the lawyers will discourage you from doing anything. A group email chat is a public meeting, and arguably it could be made legal if you advertised it and anybody who wanted to could join. So like a chat room format or something like that. But it's
a chat room or like a message board is about the only way you could do it, I think, feasibly.
Oh, a chat room. Okay, yeah, I've done this before for other committee meetings. Okay, all right, never mind. So go back. Sorry.
That raises the question: is this subcommittee? What kind of?
It would still be a public meeting.
Okay.
Yeah, right. Your objective is to advise this board.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want me to summarize the questions that I heard raised that the subcommittee would address?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly. I just think it would be good to have, rather than, I mean, unless there's another process to.
I mean, I thought that's what we were doing, was people were raising the questions that they wanted the subcommittee to address. So I thought that's what we just did, and I was just going to summarize it in a document.
So we're saying that those are the questions that.
I don't know.
What if we took a minute to just type them up and then like take a short break, type them up, and then we can all have them in front of us and also circulate it to the people who are on the phone. And then we could vote. How does that sound?
That works for me.
Yeah? Okay. And then we also get the bonus of a break.
Yeah. Okay,
Okay.
so we'll take a break.
Yeah, like 10 minutes.
Who's typing them up?
I can type.
Okay.
You've got a laptop.
Yeah, I guess I have typed them up, but
You have?
Charlie already.
I think I didn't take comprehensive notes, but I wrote, maybe I just
Maybe
read
I'll
what I wrote.
compare.
And then
Oh, yeah, sure.
see if
If you
there's
typed them
anything.
up, we,
Let's say, yeah.
should we take a break first? Sounds like people need a break.
Yes.
Yeah, let's
Sure, okay.
Yeah.
I'll do
That's
that.
great
So,
idea.
okay, let's take a break. So be
Break.
back in 10 minutes. It's 2:54. Let's be back at 3:05.
Yep,
Great.
sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, Selena, how do I get on the internet here? Is that possible?
Mozilla, yes.
Okay,
And then that's it.
perfect. All right, thanks. Easy.
Yes. Legislators are non-voting. Yeah, and they're.
I was looking at it, we're close.
No, a lot of these people are.
No, I know.
Yeah. No. Good question. Maybe should have been raised earlier. That's fine.
Yeah, I just.
Okay. Thank you.
There's hot water. No. I'm sorry, you're sick.
Here.
No. Something went around. I was sick for about 4 weeks. I was powdered through it. It was just that my whole family was awesome. Maybe just want some out?
Well, I'm actually gonna, I'll add the one.
Oh, awesome.
Since you guys are, doing a lot of talking on this.
I know,
Test.
we're talking so much.
Well, I mean.
He talks less.
We were animated today.
Share,
Yeah. We were animated today. Thank you so much for helping, sort that all out. So I have a 9-month-old and a.
Check.
The 9-month-old is really, well, he was 7 months old. He only lasted for 5 weeks, and then June was like 2 weeks, and then got married. So, but it was all right. It's fine. It's okay, he's always saddest. He's like, I don't know what's going on. Like, why is my life terrible? I was like, oh, we should come in. Yeah, just for that. It's like, I feel so bad whenever.
I spent like 2 weeks telling people why I thought it was awful. So, yeah. So what do you teach?
I teach reading and justice in class. I teach reporting. I teach storytelling. Reading honesty is knowledge. In fact, there are stories in which students have to write connections. Records are really public
Oh, you want to look at my thing? Okay, here's what I. See, there, it's not really comprehensive. But.
How'd it go? You were brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's the only one. Only one that I don't know is there. Particular issues with the way the public records law addresses.
Oh yeah, I started typing that and I didn't. Particular issues with the way
the public records law addresses PII.
Cool.
Oh, I guess. Oh no. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah. Is this what? Yeah, I think that.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's it. Never mind then. Yeah.
It seems like the bottom should be recommendation to full committee. I guess, yeah.
I mean, the licensing also came up.
Oh yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking under defining what disclosure means.
So maybe just.
Yeah, like.
And then also enforcement was raised, the question of enforcement.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, you guys didn't always.
Cool.
Okay.
Great.
Cool. I think, you wanna send that to me?
Sure.
And then.
You know, it's everybody.
And then I can email it to everybody.
That's what I think.
And then I'll email it to the people who are on our website too. They can maybe post it. I don't know if they can post it in real time, but I'll
Who's
email it.
that? What was that guy's name? And what's the other thing?
Martin?
Alter something? Alton Hoppen?
Alton.
Oh, Martin. Oh, it is Martin. This is last name first. I thought Alton Hoppen was like his first name.
Oh wait, did I get a new?
He did. He brought in more. He noticed that we were like doing that.
Oh, nice.
Get a couple more. That was nice. Well, that's good. I would love to. I think she's.
Can you crank that on the government? 1,500 of them, or no, or 1,600. Most of them are no's. No, oh, yeah. 1,600 introduced bills. And how many yeses now? I think we're 40 or 41. I don't know how many. They're not all publicly available yet. So I don't know if all of them are or not, but I did.
Okay.
Yeah, you should. In fact, I'm overdue with meetings.
Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah.
Send this to everybody.
Very cool. All right. Yeah.
No typos.
Active less.
Thank you.
That's why I'm staying away from you.
Hey, what's in there?
You know, stuff.
Talk about privacy.
Yeah, I know.
Nick, let's
go.
You guys know each other?
No.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, I'm Michelle Paul. I'm you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, what's up?
Step on these mics are so hot.
I don't know if it was on their last year.
Otherwise, I think it might be forced. Volunteer Ben. But I mean, Oregon was right. I mean, we should try to find a balance on it. Just get, you know,
Go away.
That's like
I say it all the time. I say it all the time. Like, are you kidding? Why would it county? Right.
great we had somebody else.
What's new there?
See disclosures.
So.
I mean, I would say I'll listen to it too. I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, maybe she consider it.
Like, how long?
Yeah.
I'll say an odd number. Five. Okay. So you're volunteering, we only
Should probably somebody.
So. Oh.
Yeah, this is pretty chill.
So. I think I need to.
Wow.
Lena, did you have some water?
Mm-hmm. Yep, there's even decaf.
Oh, wow. I think I'll just go for water.
Yeah, I can get it.
It's part of the challenge is to.
Okay.
Then we could ask you.
Okay.
Also ask Charlie. Refresh.
Why were you asking?
Oh, we're just thinking about whether we should as much detail as possible, including naming members of the subcommittee and the vote.
Oh, yeah, agree with that. Yeah.
And Morgan raised a good question about, do we have two government people versus, if that's a split, I'm not entirely sure that's always going to be a split government versus media.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of issues where that split won't exist.
Yeah, well, it'd be good to have Selena.
And I'm on a volunteer.
Okay, and I'll volunteer.
Probably never let you.
So the other thing,
Of all the people.
this discussion, when we reconvene to, the other possibility is we could also hold a fifth position open, give the chair authority to fill that, and that could then be you, or it could be Ben, or it could be anybody. Sure. If you want to volunteer, that'd be good too.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm happy to volunteer.
Yeah, I didn't want to put you on the spot.
I can't be the person, the chair of the subcommittee, but I can certainly be part of it. I was gonna say,
Call it the Selena subcommittee. That's
Oh,
why you said, that was what was going through my mind too. I was like, it's okay. I like that.
Sometimes being the chair is awesome because then you just tell other people to go do some work.
Well, I was going to ask if we can get staff support from Ginger.
We each have our own.
Microphone fairy godmother.
Awesome.
Okay, so I think we should get started again. I just emailed all of the members the questions that Charlie typed up. Thank you, Charlie. I also emailed them to the AG staff to post on their website. I don't know when that's gonna happen, but as soon as possible. So maybe, should I just read them? Maybe I'll just read them. Okay. What are the different kinds of PII that would be covered? Defining what disclosure means / licensing model. So subpoint publicly to everyone, press using info to verify things, and then enforcement. Rules that apply to bulk data access. In what ways should the law change? What are the particular and specific issues people have with the way the public records law addresses PII? What should never be exempt? What should always be exempt? Public interest reasons why different kinds of PII should be disclosed. Find a way to consolidate all PII into one exemption or fewer exemptions than there currently are. And then a recommendation to the full committee. Does that incorporate everything that came up in our conversation?
This is Brent. I would say yes. I think what I would recommend is that we order these questions in a way that first defines the issue and then perhaps summarizes that the subcommittee can seek resolution or a remedy. So for example, the second question, as it is here now, really goes to in part goes to a remedy as well. And so I guess I wouldn't want to put the answers before the questions. So if we can organize this in a way that helps us define those questions that the subcommittee is trying to address, and then maybe have a general question like what potential steps and remedies, should the committee endorse or recommend or examine, then the subcommittee is free to look at any of these things as opposed to being too specific in the questions. So maybe I think the first question is great the way it is. I would say the second question is what are the particular and specific issues people have? Perhaps then what should never be exempt, what should always be exempt, public interest reasons. And then the remedy would include consolidation and pathways for some groups versus others. In other words, a whole possible list of ways to remedy whatever problems the subcommittee identifies. So I think it's all here. I think it's a question of maybe of tightening it, but also organizing, ranking the questions or stacking them in a way that gives the subcommittee a path.
I'm wondering whether we need to, if it's all there, do we need to order it here, or can we not allow the subcommittee to group the questions?
Absolutely do that too.
Okay.
Yes.
I think just it would be hard to track and then send and everything. I think I would rather, if we agree that it's all there, then I think we can probably allow the subcommittee to structure the order and is that right? Does that sound right?
Yeah. It seems like it won't take that long to put it in. It has to be done either now or then. And if you just said what you said more slowly, then maybe we could just use that.
Okay.
So we have I would feel good having a very direct mandate to the subcommittee of these are the things to look at and this is the order. And of course they can deviate from that, but.
I think maybe if we simply said that the mission is to first identify the questions to answer, the problems to address, and then to identify potential steps, remedies, and resolutions, solutions. All I'm suggesting is that the subcommittee separate out, well, what is it we're trying to answer first? And what are the issues people have? And I think we might find way more agreement. The subcommittee might find way more agreement that way. And before going down the path of, for example, licensing, well, licensing might not be necessary if the subcommittee can come up with a path that wouldn't require it, for example. So why debate answers or solutions when we aren't quite sure what the problems are yet? So I'm fine with not
agree.
ordering these, but if we can simply make clear that the mission is first to identify the issues before going down that path. That help?
I agree.
Okay.
Because otherwise, we're going to be in the same spot we are right now. Is we really need to, what is the issue we want to address? That's the biggest question we have to answer. And that should be something that if we're going to, even if we're passing this off to a subcommittee, they need to be able to answer that question before they move forward. Or we're just going to continue down the same path.
So in terms of the problems to address, it's what ways the law needs to change. What are the particular and specific issues people have with the way that the public record law addresses PII? So this I wasn't sure about. What about the what should never be exempt and what should always be exempt? Is that considered problem or solution?
I would put that under addressing a question.
Okay. And then the public interest reasons why different kinds of PII should be disclosed.
And then did you say what are the different kinds of PII?
Different kinds of PII. No, because I just skipped that. Okay. So
And then it seems like the follow-up question to that is, what are they, which we actually have basically an answer to. And the real question is how, whether and how should they be different kinds be treated differently?
If I could, if a potential motion could say, for example, the subcommittee's mission is to identify and define PII. Second step would be to identify questions, issues, and concerns that, well, particular specific issues people have with the way public records law addresses PII now that we've defined PII, and then potential recommendations, proposed recommendations for the committee. That's and that way it's an umbrella for dealing with all these things. We don't have to change the order of this. We can just say if that's the mission, then the subcommittee can be free to go out any way it chooses.
With these questions in mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And those
absolutely.
umbrella sort of main sections, these subsections. Okay. Okay, so it seems like we have not yet voted to have a subcommittee. So maybe, can we do it all at once? Subcommittee, these questions?
Should we also appoint the members?
And members.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we can, that doesn't, can we do that all at once? With one motion? I don't know.
I would imagine.
Someone move it and state
I move
it.
that we create a subcommittee to study the issue of personally identifiable information and come back to the committee with a recommendation. And considering the criteria.
You cut out. I can't hear the motion.
Michael,
Sorry. Let me see if I can rephrase it in more articulate. I'm doing this off the cuff. I move that this committee create a subcommittee with the charge of reviewing the private PII information, specifically considering the questions that the committee has directed them to consider, and coming back to this committee with a recommendation.
I'll second.
Okay, we have the motion on the table. Does anyone object? Or any discussion? Sorry.
I have a friendly amendment.
Okay.
I really like the way you went at that. Can we be really clear that that the subcommittee's charge is to identify PII, to identify the issues and specific concerns with the current law, and then to come back with recommendations.
I support that or second it.
Okay.
Or something.
Okay.
Yeah, you seconded it.
But that's if you would accept that with that amendment, that would be, yeah.
I don't know how to deal with amendments.
Okay.
Yes.
I think we just are
So I'll make
discussing.
a motion that we amend the original motion to what Brett just said.
Okay. That motion needs a second, I think.
Right.
Second that.
Okay, any discussion, further discussion? No. Any objection? Okay.
So,
Now
all in favor?
I move the question.
All right.
Take a vote? Now we just call for the vote.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Those opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
There we go.
All right, I think that we should also, now that we have a subcommittee, we should name members of the subcommittee. And I heard already some volunteers in our previous discussion, so I will name the people that announced they would volunteer. Eileen, Selena, and Morgan all announced on the record that they volunteered. I also heard Brent might be considering putting his name in.
I will volunteer, yes.
Okay, so we have 4. It was suggested that we have an odd number.
I'll volunteer as well.
Oh, great. So Charlie makes 5. I think that's a pretty solid number for a subcommittee.
Can I, is Ginger, no, go ahead.
Who do they represent to me?
Eileen represents the special districts. Morgan is the Polk County Council. Selena is the member in the data community, the tech person. She works for Mozilla. Brent is the journalist or the professor of journalism, who I believe, were you selected by SPJ? Is that?
I can't remember if I'm a public position or I can't remember how I was put on, frankly. But regardless, I think I'd be seen as speaking for the media.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we have all of our groups represented.
Yeah.
We do. And Charlie is OSPERG. So there's a pretty good balance, I would say, of government and non-government members.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so does that need a motion?
Can I just ask a question? If Ginger is still on the line, I would very selfishly like to see if we could have any staff support for this, if necessary. And obviously, if Ginger's on, she can answer that question for herself.
What would staff be?
I'm not just.
I think it's more likely the Attorney General's office.
Department of Justice would be staff. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So
Michael.
we'll explore
Sure.
staffing the subcommittee. Okay, so I have been informed that we do need a motion to name the members to the subcommittee.
Before you get to a motion, I would like to just say that this is Karen in Independence. Should there be a need for somebody to excuse themselves, I would like to submit myself as an alternate member.
Okay. Should it be bigger than that? I don't know. It's
No,
5
no.
right now.
That's
Okay.
great, yeah.
Okay,
I
great.
think 5 is fine.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so Karen is the alternate. Okay. I'm waiting for a motion.
Okay.
I'll move to appoint the named members to the subcommittee.
Seconded.
Second.
Okay, is there any discussion? Those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, this motion passes. All right, so I think that's the subcommittee and sort of the current conversation about PII. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is future business. So do we want the main committee to move on to the next exemptions that we have on our schedule? Or do we want, I heard people talk about sort of low-hanging fruit, but we don't know what that is now. I mean, we haven't talked about explicitly about what are easy exemptions to consider. So the ones, let me just say, the ones in our schedule that we have coming up next, if we don't change them, it's financial information. We're still in personal information. So there's financial information, miscellaneous, and family law. Those are sort of the three main categories that we have in our planned schedule.
Can you say this again? And is that, are you looking at something that?
It's in our report,
Oh,
the
okay.
report we made to the legislature.
Oh, great. Okay.
It's the appendix.
Great.
So we're still within the personal information exemptions main category. And
I would like to make a motion that we go off the schedule and reevaluate where we can actually make some, get away from the personal exemptions, or we're going to be right back where we are. And once we have that information from the subcommittee, it's going to make those things much easier to deal with.
Okay, so what exemptions would we consider next in that event?
That's something the committee is going to have to take a look at all of the exemptions and figure out what categories there are. I don't know what Michael's whole list is. I don't have it in front of me. But maybe there's some way we can kind of address, go off the schedule and find stuff that we could address and actually make some progress with.
What about the earlier suggestion of looking at things that are just simply outdated and just, we should.
That would be my recommendation.
Do you have a list of those in mind, or was that identified in that report explicitly?
No, but I think that's something that we can probably go through and kind of look at, just a logistical to make those recommendations. I think everything that we had before was all topical.
Yeah. Who would be in the best position to evaluate that, Mary Beth?
Are you making me want to volunteer?
I am simply asking questions.
You know, in reality, I don't know who would the best person be. I mean, I don't have a problem taking a look at the list and seeing what we can identify. But Michael maybe has that list already put together, so it might be easier for him to come back to that.
I think it makes sense to have Michael and Andy. Sorry, Andy, I know you're on the phone. Michael's not, but I think it makes sense to have them maybe propose some exemptions that were passed a long time ago that might make sense to group together and review next. And it's sort of a punishment for Michael for not being here. So we'll give him work because he can't object.
Hey, Emily, this is Andy.
Hey, Andy.
Yeah, I am the keeper of that list, and the list is evolving. We're up over 600 exemptions now that we've discovered some hidden gems. The problem with starting with old stuff is so many statutes have been renumbered recently that, as a practical matter, it's very difficult to trace some of these back in an efficient way to figure out what's really old and what's not. But I'll talk with Michael about a common sense way to get at stuff that we've seen in the list that seems to be kind of the low-hanging fruit, because I think that's the more general concern, if I'm hearing you.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay.
Okay, so then so I don't exactly know how we can establish that for future business. I guess we'll just have to circulate well in advance of the meeting the ideas for exemptions that we should tackle next, and we'll keep it open. The next thing for future business is we again do because the legislative session will still be, the legislature will still be in session at the point of our next meeting. So is there anyone who can host us, like Selena so graciously did, for our next meeting, which I guess is in 2 months? Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we can do it here at the archives.
Great. Mary Beth, thank you.
Great.
So we'll be sure and circulate address and everything and notice the meeting and everything. Okay. Is that everything? Are we done?
I just thought of something for the subcommittee. Should we schedule like because that's going to need to be public, so
Oh.
we probably need to give notice that it's happening. So should we schedule a first meeting?
Good idea. Yeah.
And can it just be over the phone, or does it have to be? Should it be in person? I guess that's the other, like, meet the logistics for the subcommittee meeting.
Well, because it's a public meeting, it'll have to be advertised, and it can be done over the phone as long as the public has access to that conversation. So if we have a facility to do that in, great.
Yeah.
If not,
And I think it'll, sorry about the technical difficulties today. If everyone's on the phone,
yeah,
we can use my bridge or we can use the DOJ's bridge, I'm sure, if we get in touch with folks. But either way, like, we can work it out. I'm fine with like making sure that we get the meeting stuff posted and get all that organized. I can take that task on. But as far as like picking a time and date, that's always a fun one.
People think we should do it on the phone or in person. I'm inclined to say, now that I already said in phone, in person, if that's possible.
I think it makes for a more effective meeting if you're in person.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Agreed.
Okay.
Yeah, and I have a quick question. I wish I knew, I should know the answer to this, but doesn't there have to be a physical place that members of the public could go to even listen in to make it a public meeting?
Yeah. That's kind of the point, is they have to be able to listen in.
Well, I'm happy to make this space available. It's like,
okay.
This is fine for me. And we actually, for the subcommittee, we could use not this giant room, a smaller room. It's a little easier.
So it was suggested by Cameron that we name a chair of the subcommittee who can then distribute and organize and notify the public the agenda.
Yeah, and post everything and be responsible for it, yeah.
So
I nominate Selena.
Second.
That's fine.
Great.
Yes.
Does that need
Happy
a vote?
to do it.
We will,
That needs
yes.
a vote.
Yeah.
We have a vote, a nomination in a second, don't we?
Yeah. Okay, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Thanks, Selena, for stepping up.
Thanks, Eileen, for your support. Happy to do it.
Okay, I think that's everything on the agenda.
Well, do we want to schedule the next meeting?
I think you can
Subcommittee
do
meeting?
that.
Yeah,
Can we do that offline?
I think so.
Our chair could just communicate with us.
Say that again.
Michael's the chair and has been given authority in the past to schedule meetings.
Right, he can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
He can do that. And he can delegate to
So
her.
we can communicate with him.
Right, he can delegate to our subcommittee chair.
So what I'll do is I'll reach out to everyone. We'll schedule it and then I'll make sure that it gets posted on the website and then I'm happy to host it here.
Great.
Great.
And you'll still be able to call in if you need to.
Perfect.
Okay,
Just remember to not have any substantive conversations about it by email.
correct. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can adjourn.
All right.
Okay,
I move for adjournment.
I'll
Second.
discussion.
Yeah.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Thank you.
Thank you,
Everybody.
Emily.
Done.
Thank you, everyone.
Really?
I'm going to disconnect so we can shut down the live stream. Thank you. AV Ops.